Thank you. It's good to be here. I've watched a couple of these talks online, and I know that sometimes they're very lighthearted. This one won't be. My life started to change considerably in 2010 when about 10 Somali pirates were arrested for trying to capture a German cargo ship and hauled in front of a court in Hamburg in Germany, where I was working as a journalist. It was the first time pirates had been in front of a German judge for almost 400 years. So it was an extremely interesting story, and I started to cover it for Spiegel Online, where I was working. A lot of the German defense lawyers in the room said that their clients were just sort of poor fishermen, which is a story you've probably heard plenty of times because it's talked about sometimes when Somali pirates come up. But this was a group of 10 young Somalis armed with AK-47s and rocket launchers that boarded a cargo ship and only were kept from hijacking it when the Dutch Navy came in and overpowered them with gunfire and arrested them on the deck and sent them to Germany. So these men were caught red-handed, but by the time they landed in Hamburg, their defense lawyers had statements prepared claiming they were just poor fishermen and you know, they'd been press-ganged by real pirates and stuff like that. And again, that's a common story, and it has something to do with the roots of Somali piracy. But there's this tale you hear that most pirates are just disgruntled fishermen trying to make an honest living, but they can't, and so they go out and capture big ships. These are complicated issues, and they can be a little bit confusing. Since you're engineers, I'm going to be a little bit wonky today about them. But I'm going to talk about fishing and piracy and even Islam and a few related topics in a way that I hope sheds light on Somalia a little bit and also on what happened to me in Somalia. So I was captured and held hostage by pirates in central Somalia for over 2.5 years. And by the time I got out, I didn't think I was going to see my family and friends again. Before I went there, I had worked as not just a journalist, but also an author in Berlin, and I had traveled quite a bit to Europe and Africa, Cuba and the Middle East. I wrote a book about surfing. Cleo mentioned that it was not just about surfing, but also about the spread of American culture or pop culture, since surfing is not just American, around the world after World War II. And in the Horn of Africa, while I was doing some of that work, I met a documentary maker named Ashwin Rahman. He's a very good journalist. He's born in India but works in Germany. And since we were both living in Germany at the same time, we both had an interest in pirates. We talked about traveling to Somalia together. Ashwin had been there. He does war documentaries for German TV from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Guantanamo. He knows how to move in and out of dangerous places. So when we started to plan a trip to Somalia, we didn't do it lightly. We found a Somali elder in Berlin who had taken another journalist from Germany to the same region before, safely. And I took time and earned a grant for some of my expenses from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. We planned the trip for months. And finally, we flew to Somalia in early 2012, planning to stay for about 2 weeks. We stayed in Galkayo, which is a town you may not have heard of. It's a central Somali town where lots of pirates happen to live, but it's nowhere near the coastline. It's actually a very big city. It's 100,000 people, which is quite large for Somalia. And it's big because it's a crossroads town, and that's one reason some Somali pirates have used it as a sort of resupply town. And a place to retreat and build their houses too. From Galkayo, we made one excursion out to Hobyo, which is a town you probably have heard of. It's a pirate town on the coast. And we had a conversation with a pirate boss who called himself Mustaf Muhammad Sheikh. And he posed himself as sort of a guy who was at war with European interests somehow, with the people who dump poison waste off of Somali beaches, which the Italian mafia certainly does, and with companies that come down and take Somali fish, which French and Portuguese fishing ships have certainly been known to do, and also some Asian companies. So he was full of legitimate complaint. But it turns out that he's like a lot of antique pirates in that sense. Pirates in history have always been a little bit rebellious, and they've always had some sort of complaint to back up what they do. But with pirates, you have to untangle their legitimate complaints with their main motivation, which is greed. And I would argue that when Somali pirates started capturing big cargo ships instead of fishing ships off the coast, and especially when they started capturing people on land, that it was no longer about defending their coastline from illegal fishing. So we spent not very much time in Hobyo, just sort of a day, and we came back to Galkayo, and Ashwin decided to, there's Galkayo again. Ashwin decided to fly off to Mogadishu, and so we agreed to do everything together, and we both went to the airport with our security, saw him off. Ashwin got on the plane, and it was on the way back from the airport that a truck was waiting for us. It was actually called a technical on the side of the road between the airport and Galkayo proper. A technical looks like that. It's a flatbed truck with a cannon welded in the back, and it's a very common sort of improvised battle wagon in the Somali Civil War. This is not a picture of the one that was waiting for us, but the one that was waiting had 12 guys in the back with Kalashnikovs, something like that. And at first we thought maybe it was there to protect us. But it moved when it saw the car, and it aimed that big cannon through the windshield, and it overpowered my guard. And the 12 guys with guns came off the flatbed and over to my side of the car and pulled me out. They beat me on the head. They beat my wrist because I was trying to keep the door closed. They broke my wrist. They bloodied my scalp. They broke my glasses, which I'd been wearing and which I need. I'm extremely nearsighted. And then they bundled me into an SUV that was waiting by the side of the road, and we drove off into the Somali bush, which looks like that. And those were my circumstances after that for the next 2.5 years. We found a camp in the Somali bush where some other pirates were staying, and a couple of hostages too, but I was too confused to understand what was going on. There was a mattress waiting for me. I sat on the mattress. Somebody gave me some food, some bread and canned tuna. And that would more or less be my diet, at least for the next few months. Canned tuna and bread and some bottled water and some pasta. And in the next 2 or 3 months, I lost about 45 pounds. But for a treat, actually this is a digression, but no matter what else we ran out of, no matter what else went wrong, even if we ran out of bottled water, for some reason, we always had biscuits and mango juice. That's a sample of the vanilla biscuit box we got. It was a big part of my experience in Somalia, this brand, but in spite of the sugar, I still lost weight. So those first days were very confusing. But gradually I got to know the other 2 hostages that were there at the camp. And one of them I was thrown together with for some reason. We became partners, at least from the pirate's point of view. He and his friend were both fishermen from the Seychelles. And this guy, Rolly, was about 69, kind of a squat old man who spoke a French-inflected Seychellois Creole. That's Rolly. He and his friend Mark were both fishing about 50 miles out of their home port of the Seychelles. The main island of the Seychelles is about 700 miles from the Somali coast. And they were just cleaning their fish at night, and the pirates came up and took their boat and overpowered them with guns and said, you have to sail back to Somalia now. It took them a week. They were a week away from Hobyo. So that was one of my first impressions of life as a hostage. There was the first 2 other hostages I met were 2 poor African fishermen captured near their home and hauled back to Somalia and held for the staggering sum of $20 million by pirates who pretended to be oppressed by industrial fishing boats. So that was one myth exploded. And a few days after, so there's both of them actually. That's a picture of Rolly and a picture of Mark. I'm happy to say they're fine. That's on the day they got back from Somalia, sometime after I met them. Now, a few days after my capture, the U.S. launched a rescue to get 2 two other hostages who were there in Somalia. They'd been captured completely separately, and it was probably a different gang that was holding them, but maybe some clan relationships between that gang and my gang. They'd been in Somalia for a few months, and for some reason, 4 days after my capture, SEALs went in and got them. They knew exactly where they were. They killed 9 Somali guards and rescued the 2 hostages safely. The 2 hostages were Jessica Buchanan and Paul Tisted, an American and a Dane, and they were working for a demining NGO. And they, I mean, I've met Jessica in the meantime, really, really good people. But the rescue upset my guards. They upset, I think, some of my bosses too, because they said that they had some clan relationships to the guards. So a few days after their rescue, they made the original demand for my release, and the original demand was $20 million. My mom didn't know what to do with that one. 20 million, they probably didn't pull that out of the air. They were asking $20 million for other people, including the 2 fishermen. But they held on to it, in my case, for almost a year. So I think that has something to do with the rescue. Rowley turned out to be a chatterbox. And he told me a strange thing. He said that he had seen my picture before the pirates brought me to that camp, sort of blindfolded. One of the guards had a picture of me on his phone. And then a couple days before I arrived there with the blindfold, the guards had disappeared, which means that it was extremely well planned, and they knew what they were trying to do. And eventually I saw this picture. A guard showed it to me on his phone, and it happens to be my author picture from my second book. So they did some research on me on the internet. That narrows down the number of people who could have planned it. But it also told me something crucial, because until then I had been traveling as a German. I'm also a German citizen, and I'd only traveled on my German passport in Somalia. But the pirates must have known very well that I was an American before they decided to capture me. And the reason that's interesting is that Americans think that we have a hostage policy that keeps us safe. Everyone knows, I think everyone knows, at least every journalist knows, that the U.S. doesn't pay ransoms, and the reason it doesn't pay ransoms for cases like this, for any case of kidnapping, is that if you start to pay criminals to do that, then more criminals will do it. And so the idea is that it will keep Americans safe. The pirates were obviously trying to get money from every possible source. They called my mother, they called Der Spiegel magazine, they called the US government and the German government. They just thought that the more places they called, the more money was going to fall from the sky. It was very unrealistic, but most of my pirates really did think that the US government was going to shell out money. They just thought, well, it's the wealthiest country in the world, and so why wouldn't they? And I know that because one guard who held me for a long time, named Boshko, I have a picture, kept me updated on negotiations. And one day, a year and a half into my captivity, he came into the room very angry because someone had told him that there was going to be no money coming from Washington. In other words, until then, he had believed that there was some portion of my ransom was going to be paid by the US government. And when some Somali negotiators probably told him that it wasn't going to happen, and he had to sort of reduce his expectations for a ransom, he was really angry. And he came in and he said, why? Why won't the US pay? It's such a wealthy country. Why wouldn't they pay for one of their people? And I tried to explain the whole thing to him. But the rationale started to weaken a little bit while I was trying to explain it to him, because this was a year and a half into my captivity, and it was incredible to me that my own kidnappers weren't keeping track of these policies. Somebody wasn't listening to the politicians from behind the podiums who said, we have a hard line on this and don't even try it. And it turns out kidnappers like that either don't care or they don't know the difference between some of these countries. In fact, I knew Boshko didn't know the difference between England and France. He wanted me to draw a map at some point to show him which was which means that most of these guys conception of European geography is about as good as the average American's conception of African geography. So if you can imagine, your understanding of African hostage policy, then maybe you can understand why a lot of groups in the wider world don't keep very good track of differences in policy, if any, in Western countries. So the point is that that was a bitter way to have a second myth exploded as a captive. American hostage policy does not keep us safe in the way that we think it does. The pirates knew I was American, they targeted me on purpose, and then they held out for money in spite of what I considered a very famous hardline policy. There's some implications for that, and one of them is not that I think the US should shell out money for ransoms. But I just think it's important for an American audience to understand that the ideas we have about that policy are not always true. I want to say a little more about Boshko because he claimed not to be a pirate. He watched me every day with a Kalashnikov in his hands, but he would say on these sort of long afternoons where we had conversations, broken conversations, that he wasn't a pirate. He was just a guard. And it's possible that a great big pirate gang, there must have been hundreds of people in the network, is broken up into little cells, and you might have an attack cell and a guard cell and the cell that organizes a telephone call for a ransom discussion. Or the food. Some people just have to organize the food. But all those little groups have to be within the pirate network, and they have to be trusted by the guards. So as far as I was concerned, Boshko was a pirate. And the other interesting thing about him is that he was a very devout Muslim. In fact, all my guards prayed 5 times a day, which is a bit of a surprise to me because I thought, I knew, Somalia was a Sufi nation, but predominantly Sufi, but I didn't expect to see my pirates praying quite so often. And they were extremely devout about it, and it actually got me angry to watch them do it. And so finally I asked Boshko, I said, "You are a Muslim?" I said, "Yes," because he was very proud of that. And I said, "But Boshko, you are also a thief." I said, "These things don't go together." I said, "No, same. This was our language, And he laughed at that because he understood what I was saying. And I think it pricked his conscience because after a couple of weeks, over the next 2 weeks, he kept coming back to the topic. And finally, he gave me the justification that I think he took seriously. He said, "Michael, you are, an infidel, and the Quran says to struggle with the infidel. And we are not Al-Shabaab, so we're not fundamentalist terrorists. Al-Shabaab is the Al-Qaeda-aligned group in Somalia. We're not going to just shoot you for being an infidel. But, we do think we can take your money." Stealing from an infidel isn't theft. I thought that was a strange answer. I never heard that interpretation of Islam before, much as I've traveled around. But I thought it was odd for another reason, because Sufis are meant to be very sort of open-minded, mystical Muslims. And Boshko's answer had sort of an edge of fundamentalism in it, taking that word in the Quran very literally, that word struggle, and misinterpreting it in just the right way. But that was a third busted myth for me, because before I went, I really didn't think any Muslim-oriented pirates were going to consider themselves real Muslims as long as they were working as pirates. But, it turns out that centuries ago, Barbary pirates were no different. In the 1600s and 1700s, the great age of Barbary pirates, you had basically what was a religious war going on across the Mediterranean. There was a sort of low-burning jihad involved in these ships that sailed off from North Africa to capture Christian ships in the Mediterranean and take the people back as hostages. And that war absolutely went in 2 directions. So in other words, Christian ships came down and sacked Muslim towns on the Moroccan, what we now see called the Moroccan coast, and took hostages absolutely for religious reasons. The religious motive was the same in both directions. And this religious war went on for centuries. I knew that a little bit, but when I was in Somalia and I had time to think about it, I had this feeling of having slipped back in time. But hostages in those days, in the 17th and 18th centuries, were considered sort of lost souls, people who had dropped out of Christian society. maybe turned Turk, which was the very sort of offensive term for converting to Islam. But one of the people who did this who was captured was Miguel Cervantes. He was held by Barbary pirates for maybe 5 years. He was a soldier, and with his brother, he went out to a battle somewhere else in the Mediterranean against the Ottoman Empire, and it was on the way back that his ship close to Spain was actually captured by some Barbary pirates, and the two Cervantes brothers were taken and held prisoner in the baños of Algiers, so underneath the city of Algiers. Cervantes tried to escape 5 times. I'm not sure where he thought he was going to go, but people considered hostages in those days, to be somehow compromised because, and it's the same now, they're a little bit unfortunate, but also a little bit morally suspect because they've fallen into the hands of the enemy. They've allowed themselves to be used as pawns or to raise money for evil men, which is that's the point of a ransom. The criminal gang is raising money for more criminality. And I felt that moral compromise very deeply. In fact, I brooded over it every day, and sometimes I considered suicide. I had the idea that getting rid of myself would solve a bunch of problems. It would end the problem at home. I knew my mother was suffering. It would save any SEAL team, the incredible risk of a mission, of trying to come get me. And once in 2014, I had a radio at that point, and I heard the New York Times journalist Rukmini Callimachi talk about how some European countries had sort of paid ransoms through back channels for some people being held by Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb in Western Africa. And that just made me feel awful. I just felt, it inflamed my sense of guilt. And I know Rukmini in the meantime. I think she's terrific, and I think she's a very wonderful journalist. But this was my state of mind at the time. And I was also angry. I was angry at the guards. Excuse me. I was angry at their bosses. I was angry at myself for getting into that mess. And so every day in Somalia, especially when I was held alone, was this sort of maddening cauldron of anger and terrible food. And it was another thing I heard on the radio that helped a little bit. At some point later in 2014, I heard a homily by the Pope, a new Pope, Pope Francis. I'd never even heard of him. I didn't know what had happened to the old Pope. But Pope Francis said something about mercy, and he said, mercy is like the light of the sun. At night, you see lots of stars, and you think about your sins and your shortcomings, just like the stars. And then in the morning, the sun rises and banishes all the stars. And he said, the mercy of God is like that because it banishes your sins with its glory. And the idea was as a human, was to pass it along somehow. And I found that when I made a conscious decision to do that, to forgive people in your life, including my guards, including my pirates, my self-destructive feelings of anger and guilt and depression, to a certain extent, started to lessen. And another idea that was very sort of hooked into that, which I'm going to read about a little bit from the book, comes from Stoic philosophy. So this also had an influence on me. This was also sort of going through my mind while I was there. I was thinking in particular about the philosopher Epictetus and some of his ideas. Epictetus was an early Stoic, and he gave lectures in Rome. He was originally a Greek who was crippled and originally a slave. And so I'll read this passage to you from late in the book. Well after I had lost hope that I would even see my family and friends or my home again. I thought of them, my family, as shades from the past. I assumed my mother had packed up my apartment in Berlin and stuffed everything into storage. I hadn't spoken to her in 14 or 15 months on the phone. I knew there was a chance that this dim existence in Somalia would end in gunfire or with an unexpected hostage sale to al-Shabaab, who wouldn't mind having an American to destroy in public. I assumed the past was gone. I just moved from one moment to the next. But Epictetus said in more than one of his lectures that real human freedom is a moral choice. And it's the skill to choose good over bad and not to be distracted by impressions. This turned out to be a lot of work. By impressions, he meant not just prejudice or reflex or the first impressions that we all form about strangers who might be enemies or friends, this sort of usual bending of the light through a cognitive prism that modern psychologists also teach their clients to see. But by impressions, he also meant the basic wrong impression that good and bad can be discovered out there in the world, among hordes of uncontrollable other people. Sectarian strife, dissension, blame and accusation, ranting and raving, they are all mere opinion, the opinion that good and bad lie outside us, Epictetus said. Let someone transfer these opinions to the workings of the will, and I guarantee his peace of mind, no matter what his outward circumstances are like. That's what I did. I quit worrying about whether the guards were good or bad. I turned that critical power on myself, and I made a conscious decision to forgive them, and I quit feeling so angry and suicidal. And I firmly believe that that decision is one reason I'm still alive. Without it, I probably would have killed someone, which would have been suicidal in itself. And I believe that this sort of inner moral decision, a decision whether to forgive or not or whatever, is the only real freedom we have, no matter where we live, in a mansion or on the street or in a prison, wherever. So in the end, it took 2.5 years for my family and a dedicated team of negotiators to get me out of Somalia. The ransom was $1.6 million. And on the last day, the pirates delivered me to the Galkayo airport, where I had seen Ashwin fly away, without even telling me what was going on at first. And they put me in a car and handed me to another car, and then finally I drove up, and there was a plane waiting for me, a Cessna, a small bush plane, piloted by a wonderful British Kenyan named Derek, who I know in the meantime. He's a wonderful guy. He flew me to Mogadishu, and at the Mogadishu airport, an American transport plane, C-130, landed and flew me off to Nairobi. The ransom was raised by my mother from family and friends and some magazines I had worked for, some institutions in the US and in Germany. And it was agonizing for my family. A few days later, several pirate bosses had a shootout over that money. They had a disagreement about who was supposed to get what, and 5 top bosses killed each other, which made the FBI's job a little easier. And one Somali told me afterwards that it was a kind of a shame that I had been held for so long, but the expense of holding me for so long, and then that shootout afterwards helped destroy the gang. I hope that's true. Some pirate gangs are still working in other branches of business over in Somalia, even if it's not kidnapping or hijacking ships. But I still feel terribly humbled. I'm humbled by the horror of the kidnapping and the horror that it imposed on other people, especially my family, and also by the astonishing help that I received from a lot of people. I can't forget it, and along with some of these myths that the kidnapping managed to vaporize for myself, there's one other very important and personal myth that I think most of us walk around with all the time. And that is, I mean, I can't speak for you, but when I went to Somalia, I had this idea that I knew a thing or two about love, that I somehow knew enough to love enough to get through an average day. But after my kidnapping, my mind sort of flipped through all the people that I used to know and the pages of my memory for days. It was a little bit like that cliche of your life flipping before your eyes before you get killed, except I wasn't killed. I just thought I was going to get killed, and I had days and weeks to think about it, and I remembered the people that I loved with a profound sense of having failed to love enough. And so if I can leave you with one impression, that would be it. I have this strong suspicion that we don't love our families enough from day to day. And that may be one of the most popular myths. So if death gives you a few moments to think about it before you kick off, I'm thinking that might be one of your thoughts, that you fell short, or that You lived under this illusory cloak of anger and guilt and self-recrimination and blame, which are all intimately related, and that you should try to do a little more each day to escape that sort of evil cloak and learn to love a little more before your time comes around. I told you it wouldn't be cheery, but I can take questions.
So I was wondering, it seems like if you were there for a long time, was boredom a real problem, or what did you do to kind of keep occupied other than like thinking about the Stoic philosophers?
Yeah, boredom was an incredible problem. I didn't know what to do most of the time. You just had to sit still. Sometimes I had pen and paper, so that helped. So I could do a little writing. Sometimes I just wrote in my head and memorized things, and I would come up with long things to memorize that I would go through every morning. So a kind of mental routine in the morning. That helped too. And also doing yoga helped. When I could, I did yoga when I was being held in prison houses on land. I actually asked the pirates for a mat, and I could do about an hour of that a day. But that was only 1 hour. So boredom was an incredible problem.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm sure it's not something that's easy for you to do.
Thank you.
One of my favorite authors is Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote how hope got him through the Holocaust. So I'm wondering if you have any perspective on, channeling into hope and faith, and also how did you reintegrate back into the world and seeing people with smartphones and lollygagging around doing everyday things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like Frankl, but it's been a while since I've read Man's Search for Meaning. My relationship to hope was, it was complicated. I did not maintain hope. That was not the idea at all. And in fact, it wasn't until I learned to detach myself from hoping at all that I found a way to survive. And actually, that's a very important point. Hope has an underside. And if you keep going through that cycle from hope to despair, which the pirates were happy to keep me doing because they just kept telling me, oh, you're going to get out in 2 weeks or a month or whatever, it can be very destructive because every time you go through the cycle, you just feel worse. And I realized that if I didn't somehow take care of that, it was going to get bad. So I learned to not hope. I learned to avoid hoping and live without looking forward to the future. And that was very instructive because you can live like that. Americans don't like to think so, but you can. And that's another reason I'm still alive. What was the other part of the question?
My other question was about integrating back into the world.
Yeah, integrating back was difficult, but so I got out and I wasn't used to dealing with people who liked me. I was so used to dealing with, whenever I talked to someone during the day, dealing with having to second guess what they meant and wondering if I was being lied to and just saying something very simple and brutal and that being it. The complicated way that we interact in our own languages is something that that part of my brain had atrophied. So all the sort of cues that people get when they talk around a subject or just all the nonverbal ways that we communicate really overwhelmed me when I first got out. So I could only be in the room with a few people. But when I got out, I went to Berlin, and some of my family had sort of congregated there. And we talked about what they had done last week. We talked about really ordinary things, and having a small room full of people doing that every day, when we had breakfast, for example, at the hotel, was a strain on me, but it helped. And then after a while, I could have a party and see all my friends, and slowly I got better. But it did take about a year for me to get back to full physical and mental strength. And I don't take the mental strength for granted at all. One psychologist actually said to me that he wasn't going to diagnose me with PTSD, although I had some symptoms. But he said, we don't like to put an extra pathology to recover from. So in other words, if you think you have PTSD, that might be another condition to recover from. And in my case, that was the right approach.
You have a lot of strength.
Thank you for speaking. I was just wondering the things that, the way that you learned to mentally and emotionally survive in Somalia, do you still try to apply that today?
Oh yeah, yeah, of course. Sometimes I have to remember, but yes, I don't think too hard about the future anymore. I mean, of course I plan, but you don't live for the following week or the following year, and I don't need to. And you have to learn to, I can't get through my average week without learning to slow down and forgive people and all that kind of thing. It's a question of gratitude, and when I forget that I should be grateful about just being alive, I find ways to remind myself.
Hi, that was definitely a captivating story. Thank you for that. I wanted to ask, because I've been hearing, like words like hope and faith, and it's getting me to think about some of the Christian virtues. And it seems like through your profound suffering in that experience, you came to a very deep, probably an extraordinarily deep understanding of themes like freedom and forgiveness and love. So are you thankful for that experience itself beyond just escaping that, but just having gone through that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Not yet. That might have to work on that a little bit. But yes, I'm grateful for coming out of it, and for coming out of it with a few things to think about. Yeah, hope is tricky. I try, you can't have this experience and then pretend that it doesn't belong to you. You have to go back and forth, even if it seems like a dream now, which it does sometimes. So you have to let it be there, and you have to take from it what you can.
Why do you suppose the U.S. decided to save the other two hostages, but not you?
Probably just circumstances. I think when they plan something like that, everything has to line up, including the intelligence. You don't want operators going in there if the intelligence is wrong or somehow shaky. An abundance of caution, probably. I suspect there were plans to get me, and it was just a question of the stars didn't align. I'd rather be a hostage under a cautious president than a reckless one. But while I was there, I was like, someone just come get me, So.
I find that you tapped into the ability of forgiveness to be like one of the main healing and motivating factors for survival. I guess my question is how did you keep, even with that in mind, from being like Cervantes and trying to escape 5 times?
Right.
I think if I was in that situation a month or two in, it wouldn't be suicide. It would be like, I'm going to take as many of these guys with me as I can. Right.
Oh yeah, no, that was the temptation, and that was the idea that I had more than once, especially. So there were several phases. I was held in the bush with Rolly, and then I was held on a ship, a lot like that one. We could see that ship from where we were anchored. This was just on the beach near Hobyo, and we were on a very similar model of tuna vessel. The ship was, there were plenty of other hostages there, so I wasn't thinking about to keep me company, so I had people to talk to besides pirates. After the ship, so first of all, I did try to escape. I jumped off the ship. That's a totally different story, but it's in the book. And after that, I was taken on shore, and I was being held alone in these prison houses. And that's when I had those temptations. That's when I wanted to grab a Kalashnikov and start shooting the guards or shoot myself or whatever. It came up slowly. I mean, but at some point I had to wrestle with those feelings. And of course, even after I forgave them in my mind and reoriented my head, I thought about how to escape, how I can get out, whatever. I heard one story about a French guy in Mali, I think, who was being held by Islamists, who did get out. And for a while, he was my hero. I heard a report on the BBS, and I'm like, I want to be like that guy. But he found a way to lock one of his guards in the bathroom while he prayed. separated him from his gun, and I'm like, well, okay. First of all, he had a guard who prayed in the bathroom. The bathroom was lockable. He left the gun outside. All these things, and then he could get keys to get out of the compound. I didn't have any of those. And then, he had a fairly friendly population when he got outside. I couldn't quite, but I had plans, believe me. And the question was from day to day whether it's worth it to try. So some of the plans were violent, some of them weren't, and you don't know.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks so much for being here and sharing your story.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I wanted to ask, how long did it take you to decide to write the book, and whether you just struggled? I mean, you're a reporter by trade, and I'm sure you at least were thinking about, if I got out, I might write a book and tell people about this experience. But did you struggle at all with whether you wanted to do it or not? And then, what does life look like for you now in terms of your writing and what you're doing professionally?
So I'm a writer and an author primarily. I certainly was thinking about a book while I was there, because I had gone there to write one kind of book, and all of a sudden I realized I was going to be writing a hostage memoir if I got out. But after a while, I stopped thinking I was going to get out. It was no longer part of the plan. And the first couple of times when I had my hands on some notebooks, I obviously tried to take notes so I could have something for when I got out. But those notes were taken twice. And then I went for a long time with nothing. And then when I got paper and pen again, I started to write not about what was going on. So if something really important happened, I might make a note in German, but the guards would look at what I was writing, I think because sometimes I wrote incriminating things in the previous notebooks and got them punished. So they would sort of scan my English for their own names and place names and things like that. So I made sure to draft a novel. And after a while, they're like, is this the made-up story about the fish? I'm like, yeah. They're like, what are you doing? They didn't understand that at all. So I left with notebooks that included the draft of a novel. My worry when I got out was whether I had remembered enough, not having taken assiduous notes every day, for a book. And I'm happy to say I did. I didn't get down to writing it for the first couple of months. But once I did, I was happy to see that it was flowing, and that I had to boil down what I remembered. That's it. I mean, I don't think I doubted I was going to write a book once I was free, but it took a long time. I mean, I'm glad I had a publisher who gave me the time to do it and make it a decent book. Now I'm working on that novel, and I'm also working on, I also work on the board of Hostage US, which is a very good nonprofit that helps hostage families behind the scenes just to deal with what they're going through. Because when I got out, I noticed that talking to other hostages was far more effective for me than talking even to a psychologist. Someone who's been through that is very helpful to other people, and that goes for the families too. And Hostage US tries to put those people together and create networks like that. So.
Thanks.
So some of my question was actually what you just asked about what you were going to work on next, and how this experience would change what you would want to write about, or what kind of journalism you'd want to do going forward. Especially because the things that you've said about like suicide, for example, and depression, and finding a path to loving yourself so that you could forgive people is sounds a lot more spiritual than maybe some of your prior work on the history of surfing. And so I guess I'm wondering if that's going to compel you after your novel, you might branch into that direction. And I guess I'm also kind of secondarily wondering if you think you're ever going to go back to Somalia.
The second answer is easy, no. I mean, it would really have to change security-wise for me to go back. But I think it's not that different from what you think. Those themes are obviously important to me now. The spiritual dimension and the notion of depression and survival. Those themes are very important, but all my books up till now, on some level, including the book about surfing, have been about freedom. And so from that point of view, I'm still mining the same vein, you know. But that's an abstract idea, and you know, I can take it in any direction. And that was true about my first book, too, which was a novel, and it actually had some spiritual ideas, too. This experience obviously sharpened some of those ideas of what human freedom actually means. But that's why I read you the quote about Epictetus, is that was his central theme. You know, in fact, I think that quote is probably from a book called On Human Freedom. Those are big questions, and they're going to be interesting to me for the rest of my life.
Well, I'm curious. You were talking about the relationship you had with the guard and then the other people there. So when you were leaving, what were your parting words to them and them to you?
Yeah, it was weird because on the last day they had to convince me that I was going free. I had gotten so used to not hoping and not believing the things they were telling me that when they said, "There's a car here, you're going to go out. You know, we're going to take you to the airport." Don't believe it, you know. You can tell me whatever. And then they said, "Well, pack your things, you're going to go." Okay, I guess I'll pack whatever little things I had into this bag. But then they shook my hand. Okay, I guess I'll shake your hand. They smiled and everything. I'm like, yeah, no. Whatever. I started to believe then that I was probably going to get shifted somewhere, probably to another gang. And that was it. I mean, they did attempt a formal goodbye, but it was this weird sort of tense situation where I wasn't sure whether to believe them or not.
What happened to your fellow captors, the two fishermen?
The two fishermen?
How did they escape?
It was so those guys got out after a full year in Somalia. Also, I think with a ransom. They wound up in the Seychelles by November of 2012. So I knew Rolly for about eight months there at the beginning of 2012. And then after I left the ship, he also left the ship, and they put him back together with Mark, and they flew away. My pilot, Derek, by the way, also flew them out, and he told me that within the first few minutes of our flight out of Galkayo. I couldn't believe it, you know, somebody knew friends of mine. So.
I think that's going to be it. Let's give them another round of applause.